Being a veteran is a profound honor, one that carries with it the weight of service, sacrifice. We owe our veterans a profound debt of gratitude not just for their service, but for the immense courage they show in transitioning back to civilian life. The Making History Project mission is to honor and preserve the legacy of our veterans by documenting and sharing their stories with future generations. We aim to ensure that the sacrifices and experiences of those who served are never forgotten, fostering a deeper understanding and appreciation of our collective history. Making History Project presents Echoes of Service.
Okay, this is Patrick Russell. I am interviewing Jordan Tygh for the first time. This interview is taking place on November the 19th, 2024. And Jordan is in Riviera Beach, Florida. So Jordan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Excellent, thank you. This interview is being conducted by the University of Miami, the University of Miami Veterans Resource Center, and the Making History Project. So why don't we start with when were you born, Jordan?
So I was born May 16th, 1991.
And how old does that make you today?
33.
All right.
Wish I was a little younger, but it is what it is.
Okay, and where were you born?
I was born in San Ramon, California, in the Bay Area.
All right. And can you describe that hometown for me when you were growing up? What was it like?
So I didn't grow up there. I was born there, but when I was 2, we moved down to Orange County, Laguna Beach, to be more particular. It was just a really cool beach town in Southern California. Really awesome place to grow up. You know, really a relatively small, like kind of coastal resort style town. You know, I'd go swimming in the water. As a little kid, I'd play like looking at the tide pools and all the fish and stuff. So it was a really, really cool place to grow up.
All right. And how big was your family when you were growing up?
I'm an only child, so it's just 3 of us.
All right. And what do your parents do?
Well, they're retired now, but growing up, they owned a silicon distribution company. So they basically buy larger portions of silicon, chop it up a bit, sell it to, you know, research places, universities, companies that needed silicon, essentially.
Okay. And where did you end up going to high school?
I went to J. Sarah Catholic High School. It's a private Catholic school in Orange County, San Juan Capistrano, to be exact.
All right. And what year did you graduate?
2010.
And did you have any sports or hobbies back then in high school?
Yeah, I was on track and field and cross country.
All right. Are you a distance runner?
Yeah, you know, I'm more built kind of for sprinting, but I ended up being a little better at distance, kind of that middle of the road type, you know, mile run type of thing. But I did pretty well my freshman year in cross country.
Okay. And after high school, what did you end up doing?
So I went to the Arizona State University and got my bachelor's, where I studied political science. I did an internship on Capitol Hill in the House of Representatives. I also did one at the district office in Arizona for Senator McCain in the Phoenix office for the Senate side. After that, I decided to get my master's degree at the University of Southern California. I wanted to go back home, and that was a really good university for that local area to be a part of that alumni network. While I was there, I had decided I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do. A lot of my friends from high school or undergrad had went into work like the regular jobs or normal type things, and that's kind of where the military started to like come to play for me. You know, they were working 9 to 5, working for the weekend, and you know, I was still having fun in college. You know, I went straight into graduate school, so I still had that. You know, I was 22 years old. I still had that young man mindset of just having fun and going to class and stuff. But that's where I got the idea of, is like, I saw them in the normal 9 to 5s, and I thought to myself, I kind of want to do something a little different. And I also go back to my experience, particularly entering the U.S. Senate. McCain's office was very veteran, military-oriented type of office. So I was kind of surrounded by a lot of military type of people and constituents calling in. Those two experiences kind of like came together for me to think, hey, maybe I should do military. I assumed I was going to go work in public policy, and I thought having a military background beforehand would be good for that. Most people in the military, they go into either the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, or the Marines. Coast Guard, which is the first branch I joined, is much smaller. So I figured going into public policy, it would make a lot more sense to be from that smaller branch, that I'd have more to give. There'd be less Coast Guard veterans, right? So I figured I would have more value bringing that experience. It was a combination of that, but also, growing up there in a coastal town in Southern California, I'd always see those Coast Guard helicopters fly by, and I just thought it was cool and different. So I ended up enlisting in the U.S. Coast Guard.
And what year was that?
That was 2016. So that's when I finished my first master's, and I was all ready to go with the job in the Coast Guard after that.
Okay. And so tell me what it was like joining the Coast Guard. What did you first have to do?
Well, I had to go to boot camp first, and that was definitely a culture shock. Growing up a relatively privileged lifestyle, especially coming out of college where it's relatively relaxed and whatnot, to a very intense basic training. Coast Guard basic training on the enlisted side is the second hardest out of all the enlisted basic trainings. So that was definitely like a change of pace and a wake up call. Then when I got out of boot camp, I went to my first ship, a national security cutter, as a seaman, an E3, which was also, a huge change. Coming from a graduate degree to being an E3 in the military is not really a normal path. The reason I enlisted was because the Coast Guard has such a small officer corps. It's kind of unrealistic, even with a master's, to go straight in as an officer. So I went in, enlisted. But the lifestyle was more designed for an 18-year-old versus like a 25-year-old, that I was at the time. So it was definitely a massive change. But I think it was good for me. A lot of my former classmates and stuff went straight into their kind of more white-collar type of work. I was there, as a seaman, because, everyone in the Coast Guard, you start out as a seaman or a fireman. I was handling lines, dealing with anchors, getting my hands dirty, being a mess cook sometimes, painting, doing all sorts of stuff. So I think it really built a lot of character in me to start my military career there, especially considering kind of that culture in the military. When you're at the bottom of the barrel, you kind of get beaten down a little harder metaphorically than everybody else. So I was going from like kind of a good graduate institution to kind of being beaten down at that lower level. But again, looking back, I think it built a lot of character, and I think it was ultimately good for me and a great experience.
So when you ended up going to boot camp, you were 25.
Yeah, I had just turned 25.
And you already had a master's degree.
Yes.
And so some of the other seamen that you were working with were, 18, right? Yeah, much younger than you?
Yeah. Now, granted, the Coast Guard, since it's smaller, it was, especially during this time in 2016 when they were, decreasing the size of the military, was hard to get into. So you did run into guys and girls that were 22, 21. There's some people even older than me at the time. But yeah, you didn't run into as many 18-year-olds, but you ran into some of them. It's just more that lifestyle was designed for an 18-year-old. But I'd say the average age was like 20, 21.
All right, so you're a little on the older side.
Mm-hmm.
And where was boot camp?
Cape May, New Jersey.
All right, and you said that it was pretty tough. Like, tell me a little bit of why that was. Like, what was it that you recall that was challenging?
Well, it's just a big part of Coast Guard basic training is mental toughness, which to me, I've always been decently athletic. That was the tougher part than the physical stress. They would play kind of mind games with you. You had to memorize certain things, do things a very specific way. When you have no military background or no military family, it's really kind of a new thing to you, especially coming from a very relaxed college, fraternity boy type lifestyle. Unlike the other branches, the Coast Guard is allowed to revert you for very minuscule reasons. So it's very easy to get sent back. And that's always kind of like they held that over your head of like, oh, you messed up too much, we'll send you back a week. And in that kind of environment where you want to get out and finish it, that's a devastating thing to be told you have to be sent back a week. And they can keep doing it until, 4 or 5 times and they'd probably kick you out. But they can keep sending you back. And some people stay there 13, 14 weeks. So that is kind of always over your head, and they have little punishments, and they do all sorts of physical things where they kind of turn recruits against each other. Very, very stressful.
And you already mentioned that you didn't have any other family members that were in the military?
No direct. So my dad wasn't. Obviously my grandpa. Both my grandfathers had been in the military. I had 2 uncles in the military. But it's not like we talked about it much. They didn't raise me. It wasn't part of our lifestyle at home or anything. A lot of my friends didn't go off into the military. Growing up in an area like Orange County, which is a relatively well-off area, it's just not as a common thing for people growing up in that kind of environment to go and join the U.S. military. Some did. But going into things like finance or real estate is a much more common thing. So it just wasn't something I was as exposed to. I think my biggest exposure to it was interning in Senator McCain's office, where I dealt with lots of veterans and whatnot.
And how did your family feel about you entering into the Coast Guard?
Oh, they weren't happy. Like I said, I'm an only child, so they really they wanted me to do something more, kind of traditional, or what their friends' children were doing, the kind of stuff their friends' children were doing. I remember specifically my parents had this friend who was doing YouTube and was doing reality TV and stuff, and he lived on a boat, and they were filming themselves on a boat. And I remember very specifically disappointing my mom, like, oh, he's on this fun boat, living here, having fun, filming YouTube videos, having girls over and stuff, and you're there on a boat, dealing with the anchor on essentially a warship, right? Like in a military environment, getting sent overseas. Like, she had wished that I was doing fun stuff on a boat, filming silly videos or things like that, versus serving the country in uniform. But they were still proud of me. They were still definitely proud of me. It just wouldn't have been their first choice.
All right. And what were your overall dates in the military?
So in the U.S. Coast Guard, I had sworn in I believe it was April, and I was the DEP program, until June, when I had actually went off to boot camp. And then I had gotten out in May of 2020. So it was 4 years. And then I had a break in service for about a year and a half. So in November 2021, I commissioned in as an officer in the Navy Reserve, where I still serve today.
Okay. And so far, what is your highest rank?
Lieutenant junior grade. So I'm currently a lieutenant junior grade, or O2, in the Navy Reserve.
Okay. And what was your role while in the Coast Guard? Where did they start you off in?
So I started off on a national security cutter, and I was a seaman. So basically, I had to, handle the line, work with the anchors, paint the boat. And then they actually moved me, as I became a little more senior as a seaman. They moved me to be a master helmsman. So when we deployed, everybody had to man the helm and do lookout and whatnot. But for more intense evolutions, so when we chased down, speedboats that the drug cartel used, full of cocaine and other substances, they had to have an actual helmsman driving the ship and steering the ship. So, but you had to be a more expert one, which we called a master helmsman. So I got that expert training and qualification. So a lot of times when we chased down the speedboats, I would be steering the ship and chasing them down. Also, going in and out of ports was a much more complex evolution. You obviously can't put that in in any kind of automatic drive or anything. So I would actually have to steer and go through and take commands going through these various ports. And I mean, throughout my career, I had gone through, I'd gone over the Golden Gate Bridge, I'd gone through Pearl Harbor, I went through the Panama Canal. So I got to do a lot of cool stuff. So that's kind of where they started me out in the Coast Guard. Then I switched units as a seaman to a housing unit, which was very laid back. That was in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I helped members, move into their housing, help them move out of their housing, kind of help manage all that sort of stuff. Not a very traditional military job, but it was definitely a more laid back experience in comparison. Then I went off to my official job training, which I started out as a storekeeper. So I specialized in logistics and procurement. I got stationed on another national security cutter, this time the Coast Guard Cutter Bertholf. The first Coast Guard cutter was the James, that was based in South Carolina. The second was the Bertholf, which was based in Alameda, California, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. That's where I served as a storekeeper. So my primary duties there were, purchasing stuff for the different departments in the ship, just about anything you can imagine, and then handling the procurement of it. So we'd be deployed overseas, and I would make sure that packages were coming in the middle of the ocean. I'd work with like the Navy, for example, to make sure we people who had ordered stuff, we'd get our packages from these various Navy ships that could drop them off via helicopter onto the ship out in the middle of the Pacific. But I also had a lot of collateral duties, so I continued my skill as a master helmsman. One of the deployments we went on was to Asia to enforce sanctions in North Korea. And it was actually interesting. So I was manning the helm when we first entered the Taiwan Strait. Part of it was a freedom of navigation patrol through the Taiwan Strait. I was manning the helm, and we were the first Coast Guard cutter to ever go through the Taiwan Strait in history. So by manning the helm, I became the first person to steer a Coast Guard cutter through the Taiwan Strait in history.
All right, pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure. They said we were the first. Oh, sorry.
All right. Tell me, how large are these ships that you were on?
So they're 418 feet. They're called national security cutters. They're originally designed for the Navy. The Navy didn't want them, so naturally it kind of got pushed over to the Coast Guard. And they've been able to work really well for law enforcement operations that the Coast Guard does.
And that was my next question. So what is their primary role?
So the primary role they use them for right now is I mean, they're used for various different reasons, but I would argue the primary one and what you see most of them doing are anti-narcotics missions. So it's going to South America and kind of chasing down the various speedboats that the cartels utilize, or even semi-submersible submarines that the cartels utilize to transport cocaine.
Okay. And you were involved in those missions in your first ship?
Yes. So I did one deployment for that on my first ship, which was the Coast Guard Cutter James. I also did another deployment for that on the Bertholf, which was my last deployment. On the Bertholf, I had done two deployments. The first one, as I mentioned before, was sanctions enforcement on North Korea, but also kind of to build relations with various Asian allies, both Navy and Coast Guard, to work with them, and also to do that freedom of navigation patrol through the Taiwan Strait.
Okay. And we're going to get to that Taiwan Strait again.
Yeah.
I want you to tell me a little bit more about some of these memorable missions you may have done chasing down the narcotic vessels. Do you recall any of those of particular note?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was always exciting. So I remember my first one. I was on watch, manning the helm. The captain of the ship, I believe it was him or the XO of the ship, had kind of taken the lead for this one, and they were giving me commands. So they'd be like, left, right rudder, or 10 degrees right rudder, or 10 degrees left rudder, because we were essentially following these speedboats way out in the distance. It's probably about 1 o'clock in the morning, local time where we were in the Eastern Pacific. And
outside of what country?
People. I'm sorry, what?
Outside of what country? Like, where were you located?
I can't remember exactly where it was. I think we were about 300-400 miles away from the Galapagos Islands. Might have been the closest we were to, but we were out in the middle of the ocean. This wasn't off any coastline. We were really out there. I can't remember the exact spot, but I mean, generally it was general Eastern Pacific area, probably near Colombia, give or take. Not sure exactly how far off the coast, but we were out there. I remember being there, and and I'm getting these commands and I'm making sure they're on point, steering left, steering right, kind of going that direction. And then you tell them to launch a helicopter. So while I'm driving, they're launching a helicopter off the back. That helicopter has a sniper on it, so that launches way ahead. Even though we're starting to chase, the speedboat is pretty far away. The sniper, he'll take out the engine from the helicopter that makes the drug runners dead in the water. And then once we get close enough, we slow down, and we have a smaller boat with our kind of law enforcement type guys that kind of have their bigger guns, and they board and they actually, detain the guys. They get all the drugs and weapons they have, if there's any weapons. But yeah, I remember that in that moment, my first chase was wild to me because, again, it's late at night. I'm getting all these commands. A bunch of people are up there on the bridge. People have their night vision goggles on, all this cool stuff, and it felt like a movie almost. 2 months before this, I was getting yelled at in boot camp, and then 2 months before that, I was at the fraternity house at the University of Southern California, having fun. So that in that 5-6 month period, now I'm driving a warship, at 25 knots, chasing down a speedboat full of cocaine in the Eastern Pacific. There's a wild turnaround.
And what about, you mentioned submersibles? You recall any of those?
Yes. So on my last deployment, we had come across one, and it was already dead in the water at the time. I know you've probably seen that cool video of them kind of on a high-speed pursuit against one of the submersibles that went viral a couple years ago. It wasn't that one, but it was the same kind of submersible. But I just remember we had caught it, and actually one of my additional duties at that time, I was on the what you call a Snoopy team. So it was kind of, you took pictures, took notes, things like that to kind of pass along to the intelligence people. So I was there taking pictures of it and making sure we had all the evidence of it. And another one of the ships ended up taking it, and they brought it back to the United States.
And was it empty?
Well, there were guys on it, so we detained them. And that actually was one of my additional duties as well during my last deployment, was being what we call a detainee watchstander, which is essentially makes you a prison guard. So you went through a couple days of training, learning how to different fight techniques. You have to get pepper sprayed. You got a baton. You had to learn how to fight with a baton. But all that qualified you to become essentially a prison guard. Even though we're not arresting them, we're just detaining them. You had to basically watch them, and so that was also kind of a new experience for me. A lot of these guys, they come from various backgrounds, but these were people who work for the cartel, and they're chained to the ground, and you're essentially tasked with watching them now.
And how big was this submersible?
I don't remember the exact size. I wasn't on the boarding team, so I wasn't actually hopping on it or anything. And it's a semi-submersible, so it's basically, they make these down in the jungles in South America, where they basically put something on top of a regular boat and kind of rig it to where it can kind of go down a little bit, but not all the way down. Otherwise, they just go all the way down and try to avoid us. But they don't have that kind of technology to be able to do that. They can just make it kind of where it's semi-submersible. I did hear from the people who actually boarded it and hopped on that it smelled really bad, because there's no air conditioning on there. Those guys are out there for days sweating. They have their old food on there. They're going to the bathroom on there. So I heard it was, the guys that did hop on there, they had talked about how it was some of the worst smells they smelled in their life.
And did you have the opportunity to interact with some of those guys that were detained?
Yes. Basically when I was watching them. I mean, we weren't really conversing with them. My Spanish is limited, and I don't think any of them spoke English. But, when they had to go to the bathroom or take a shower, we had to escort them to make sure they weren't doing anything, funny or trying to get away. So kind of that was my interaction with them. Or when, they wanted food, for example, when it was the meal time, sometimes we'd have to run down there and let the cooks know. So the cooks would come up and bring them food. So it was very limited interactions. It's almost like, obviously, detainee watchstander, prison guard, they all sound cooler, but it really felt more like being a babysitter, if anything. A lot of these guys know, they knew that if they were on their best behavior, they'd be more likely to get off, or have limited time in jail. Not that I ever got to that point. My job was just kind of detain them and pass them on to the DOJ or pass them on to whoever we pass them on to. Again, I was enlisted. I was very low level at the time. I just did what I was told. I don't know exactly how the process went after, but from what I was told was, the cartels have some of the best lawyers in the world. So they had to really be on their best behavior. So likewise, if we had done anything wrong, this is what I was trained on. If we did anything wrong, that could be used in a case of court, like, these Coast Guardsmen didn't treat us right, human rights violations, et cetera, et cetera. So we had to really be on our best behavior too. They were on their best behavior. So I have no doubt that some of these guys have done some pretty bad things in the past, but it was really just everybody was on their best behavior for various reasons type of situation.
And how many of these, we'll call them captures, do you think that you had to deal with so far in your career?
It's really hard to say. That first deployment was in the year 2016. No, 2017, the very beginning of 2017. So I don't remember how many people we caught. The days go by when you're out at sea there. So it's kind of hard to put together. Back then, I wasn't a detainee watchstander either, so I really didn't interact with them at all. It wasn't until my last deployment, and we had gotten a number on that last deployment, but not quite as much. The helicopter broke quite a bit during that last deployment, so there weren't as many captures as there were on my first drug deployment.
And how many other similar Coast Guard vessels are out there doing the same thing nearby?
Oh, there's a lot. We had done prisoner swaps with some, some of these. We were on pretty much the largest Coast Guard ship, other than some of the research and ice breaking vessels they have. But for this operational type work, we were essentially on the largest platform. So some of these smaller ones that were like 220 feet, for example, those ones would pass along. So, if they got overcrowded with their detainees or their drugs, we would kind of take it from them and let them go out and do kind of hunting, if you will, is what they call it. It sounds bad, but you're kind of hunting down these drug boats. But even though we would kind of actually do these pursuits ourselves, we'd kind of relieve that stress from them. And then sometimes, other ships, whether they were smaller or the same platform, they'd be going home earlier, ending their deployment earlier. So we would pass, detainees along to them, so we would free up space.
And anytime they resisted?
Well, no, not really. I mean, really, the only resistance they would normally have is being chased. So I mentioned in that second deployment, they had our helicopter wasn't working, and kind of having that air power is one of the strongest things they have, because once you take out their engine, they're dead in the water. But when we didn't have a helicopter, we essentially had to get into high-speed pursuits. So we would be going very fast as a national security cutter, and then we'd launch the side boats. We had two smaller, high-speed boats that we'd launch, and they'd actually go on high-speed pursuits against these ships, or against the speedboats. So in those instances, they can actually get away. They still have their engine. They're running for their lives, and often they did get away. Sometimes they didn't, but oftentimes they did. During those moments, the small boat people, from what I recall, was if they could get close enough, they'd have a gunner's mate that would try to shoot out the engine from the other boat to kind of make them dead in the water. Otherwise, it's just a very difficult thing. You're waiting for somebody to run out of gas. It did work sometimes, but I know often they did get away in those instances. So that was certainly an area where they were going to resist. But once we, in the instance where we had the helicopter, we took out their engines, they would, all they would do is basically throw the cocaine over water, because then they could be like, hey, we're just fishermen. Even though we'd eventually catch it, most of the time they wouldn't be able to get enough off. That's kind of their last hope, is like, hey, let's throw all this cocaine in the water. There's no evidence. It's all sunk. There's nothing they can do to us now. So that's the closest to resistance that I had ever seen. Otherwise, once they're caught, and, again, I believe they're probably instructed to be on their best behavior at that moment on, so they could get out as soon as possible.
They're not shooting back.
No, I had never dealt with that. I don't know if it's ever throughout the history of the Coast Guard, if that's happened or not. I'm not sure, but basically how the game is played now, if you will, they don't shoot back.
All right, and then let's go back now to the Straits of Taiwan. So, walk me through that. You're going there, and are you the only ship, or you have several ships doing these maneuvers?
So when we entered Asia specifically, or when we went through the Taiwan Straits?
Through the Taiwan Straits.
So through the Taiwan Straits, we were actually paired up with a Navy ship. We met up with them beforehand, and we basically followed them. And what's unique was China would always have shadows for the different boats, the different ships in the region. So there was a Chinese Navy vessel following our U.S. Navy vessel, but a Chinese Coast Guard cutter was following our Coast Guard cutter. And once we got close enough to Taiwan, all of a sudden the Republic of China Navy and Republic of China Coast Guard, or Taiwanese Navy, Taiwanese Coast Guard, however you want to refer to it, they came up as well. So it was basically 6 ships entering the Taiwan Strait. In the front, you had on the left-hand side, on the China side, you had the, PRC Navy ship, then the U.S. Navy ship in the middle with us following, and then the Republic of China Navy ship, or Taiwanese Navy ship. And then on the back was the 3 in the same order was the 3 Coast Guard ships from each nation. And it was just the 6 of us kind of chugging through there.
All right. And any type of maneuvers that the Chinese Navy employed against you when you were doing any of this stuff?
Yeah, they got close, and they basically got on the radio and told us, you're not allowed to do this. This is you're entering our territory. You're stopping our sovereignty. He was saying this in Mandarin, and we had a Mandarin translator there at the time. I believe he was from the Air Force. So there are only so many Mandarin translators within the military. We got people from the Army because we need people speaking Korean, all sorts of languages. So we had all sorts of people from every branch on that, from various branches on that ship. I think he was an Air Force guy, but he was translating for us what the Chinese were saying. Excuse me. I don't remember exactly, but they were basically reading from a script what to say, that we're not supposed to be there. And then our captain would get on the line, and we'd have our translator get on there, and he was essentially reading from the United States script to say, hey, this is completely legal. We're allowed to do this. Again, I forget what the exact lines were, but it was just kind of that basic kind of Navy freedom of navigation script that was being used. They didn't do anything crazy. I mean, the trek through the Taiwan Strait was long. I was there for about 3 to 4 hours going through. Then the next guy on watch came through, so I'm not sure the drama that happened then. But I know it was a day or two later, the largest Coast Guard cutter in the world. It's like 900 to 1,000 feet. It's a PRC Coast Guard cutter, largest of any Coast Guard ship in the world. Got about like 500 feet from us. They came pretty quick and got about 500 feet. We had to go. We had the alarm sound. People had to kind of report to their different stations, just in case. They didn't do anything. It was just kind of their way of being like, hey, this is like, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have gone through there, type of thing. But they did get really close to us with their largest ship, and it was done as a response about a day or two later.
And what was that like? What were you doing at that moment?
I think it was in the morning, so I think I was woken up. And I don't remember my exact station. It might have been helm because I was a master helmsman. It might have been, I forget. There was various different type of alarms that they had. I forget what that ship specifically called it, but I had to report to a specific station. I can't remember where. I know on my first ship they had me as a 50 caliber loader. So we never had that when we were chasing down the drugs, but if anything like that happened, I had to go to the back of ship and support one of the higher ranking people. When that person would shoot the 50 caliber machine gun, I had to load it for them in case of an emergency. And if they were killed, I had to go and take over and now be the gunner. So I had to be trained on it and everything. But for this ship, I can't remember where exactly they had me for my battle station. I forget what actual emergency they had called. I just remember a brain fart. This is several years ago now. But I had to report somewhere, and then it was kind of quickly like, okay, we're good, because the Chinese left pretty quickly after that. They weren't hanging next to us 500 feet for about an hour. It was pretty quick, like, hey, we're getting really close, and then we're leaving. And And that had been happening for a couple of years, whether it's with the Chinese Navy or the Russian Navy. It wasn't too out of the norm for these ships to do things like that.
All right. So that ship, the Chinese ship, was more than twice as big as yours.
Yeah, significantly bigger. I mean, again, Coast Guard ships aren't usually used for those certain kinds of purposes. Like you think of like a Navy aircraft carrier, that tends to be very large. Like they're used for very specific purposes, military type purposes that the Coast Guard don't necessarily need to use for as much. So it's a very unique ship for the Coast Guard. Again, this is the Chinese Coast Guard. It's a very unique one that they have, but yeah, it's much bigger. And I think something really interesting to say about that whole deployment and experience, how Coast Guards work throughout the world, they're recognized differently. So here in America, the Coast Guard serves many different purposes, whether it's law enforcement, military, search and rescue, environmental protection. Some countries like the UK, I believe, is just strictly law enforcement. Some countries, it's strictly military. Some countries, it's kind of a mix of different things. Chinese Coast Guard is also considered a military branch. So what was so unique about us being shadowed by Chinese Coast Guard ships and having a Coast Guard ship like that come against us, it was really a preview of like a Coast Guard military versus a Coast Guard military, which is something you don't come across too much. Throughout its wartime history, Coast Guard has been engaged in combat operations, but it's often to support the other branches. This was a unique scenario where it was two Coast Guard military branches kind of going toe to toe, even though we weren't fighting or anything. It's just something that, I don't know how many times that's happened in history before, where you kind of have these two competing nations, if you will, or adversarial nations, if you want to call the U.S. and China that, really kind of being somewhat aggressive with each other, but specifically both Coast Guard, not Navy or Army or any of the other branches.
Any other similar experiences during that deployment in the Taiwan Straits?
No. I mean, it was mainly just, constantly being shadowed by a kind of equivalent Chinese Coast Guard cutter, one of their smaller ones. I forget the exact size, but it almost looked identical to our boat. There were definitely some differences, but they were shadowing us the whole time. There was one instance when we got closer to the island of Japan, and a big Japanese Navy ship, they just came, like they did not want the Chinese Coast Guard cutter anywhere near their country. So they came and they did a quick sweep, like go around, and that Chinese Coast Guard cutter was gone. So I remember that was kind of an aggressive moment, but that was really more between two other countries. They just didn't want the Chinese getting any closer to Japan. So that was kind of what I remember. We had dealt with them quite a bit, and sometimes we deal with two of them, or sometimes it'd be the Navy. I remember when we first entered kind of close to China, they actually sent a Chinese Navy ship, not a Coast Guard ship, kind of coming right at us, and then it didn't get too close, but it was being very aggressive because they did not want us, floating around what they considered their territory.
And how long were you out in that area?
So that deployment as a whole was a little over 5 months. Obviously it took about 3 to 4 weeks to get out there. We had stopped in Hawaii first for a little bit and eventually got out there, but it's quite a long trip to get out there. And then quite a long trip back too, obviously. So time in theater, I would say it was about like 4 months. I'd say a little over 4 months. And we were all over. We went down and we did kind of diplomatic type missions, working with other navies or Coast Guards in like the Philippines, for example. We did some training with the Philippine Coast Guard. Same with the Koreans. We did some training and work and kind of building relations with the Korean Navy and the Korean Coast Guard. We stopped at one of their bases in Jeju Island. So we went as far as like Singapore. We spent time in Singapore doing work on the boat. We also went up to South Korea. We stopped in Hong Kong. We stopped in various different countries, Japan on multiple occasions. So we were in that in basically the Asian theater for about, I'd say, 4 months, but all over.
Okay. And what happened after that deployment?
So we'd come back, and I should mention kind of the primary mission of that deployment was enforcing sanctions on North Korea. So really our main goal in being out there was stopping ship-to-ship transfers. So the Chinese were illegally giving oil to the North Koreans. UN had sanctioned them, basically saying that they couldn't get oil from the outside, but China, like various Chinese ships, were giving them. Now, when I say Chinese ships, I don't mean actual military ships, but some kind of ships that were from China were illegally giving them ship-to-ship transfers, giving them oil. We were going there with the intention of actually kind of doing law enforcement operations to break it up and stop them. We never got the go ahead to do that, but we had our people kind of take pictures and have proof to send back to say, hey, look, they're actually doing this. So that was kind of the main goal of the mission. So a lot of our mission was spent around kind of the Korean Peninsula, even though we kind of were all over the place. But when we came back, yeah, I had about 3 months off. It was pretty brutal. I mean, it was great to come back after such a long deployment to San Francisco there. Then about 3 months later, that's when I went on my last deployment, which this one was only 2 months, I believe. No, 3 months. I take that back. It was 3 months to do another drug deployment, my last deployment in the Coast Guard.
This is also South America?
Yeah, this was back to South America. This time, since I was coming from the West Coast, we didn't have to go through the Taiwan or through the Panama Canal, but it was still the same kind of theater, the area of that Eastern Pacific.
Okay. And what's it like to be on your Coast Guard ship for like 3 months out and about? What's the lifestyle like out there?
You know, it can, you know, the beginning it's okay, and then you kind of get a point where it's kind of rough, and then you get to a point where you just get used to it. It's weird. I don't want to compare it like being in jail, but you know, you're out there on this kind of tin can ship and you can't leave. So you're just kind of stuck in this area with the same daily routine. It's obviously not a luxurious environment at all. So it's just kind of just constant routine. You don't have internet. I mean, you have internet on the computer, but it's slow. You know, you can't get on your phone or anything like that. There's no Wi-Fi. So you're downloading movies for entertainment at night, but you're working long hours. So, you know, you have to stand 4 to 8 hours of watch every day, but then you have your regular job on top of that. And then they're calling you down to launch helicopters every so often. So there was an additional thing I had to do was run out and help launch the helicopter under the blades when they'd be, you know, chasing down the drugs or whatnot. But yeah, it was long periods of time, and you were basically, whether it was Asia or South America, you were always looking forward to that next port call, you know, not only to get food that's not boat food because the boat food gets old really fast, but to kind of get a break from that daily routine. See, walking on land again feels really amazing after only walking on metal all the time. When you actually get on physical land again, that feels great. And then seeing a new place is obviously fun. I mean, I think my best memories in the military are probably traveling and seeing the world, which I otherwise wouldn't have been able to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now after your last deployment, where does your military career take you? So you're winding down, at least in the Coast Guard?
Yeah, so I'm coming to the end. As I mentioned before, I wanted to go work in public policy, so that's kind of what I was looking to do at the time. Even though it didn't work out eventually, but that's where my mind was at the point. But I knew I kind of wasn't done with the military. Like, I still had a desire to be in it in some capacity, maybe just not full time. So I got the idea of the reserves. I wasn't super into logistics. I mean, my bachelor's degree was political science. I know when we would deploy to Asia, for example, I was really interested in the mission, even though really my job was logistics and procurement and then driving the ship around. You know, other than that, like it's really not my job to know about, how the Chinese are giving the North Koreans oil or where our target is. Like, that's a much higher security clearance level than mine. It's not my job, but I was very interested in it. I was interested in all of it. So I knew I wanted to do something that was kind of more in depth on, kind of the mission, the operational side. So intelligence made a lot more sense. And I kind of knew I wanted to switch over to the officer side. I was more interested in kind of managing I had friends that had joined the military on the officer side, and I could see the lifestyle was better, the pay was higher. So I knew I wanted to do something a little different, and I knew I wanted to be an officer, and I knew I wanted to go in the reserves. So reserve officer Coast Guard programs, they had their boards once a year. The Navy has a very similar program for their reserve officers, how they enter and everything, but they did it twice a year, and they had direct commission, so you could go straight in as like an intelligence officer, for example, which I am, what I am now. In the Coast Guard, you can't. You just go in as a general officer, and then you fill whatever role depending on what area you get stationed in. So the time of year where I went through a board, it ended up falling where the Coast Guard did not have it and the Navy did. So I was like, okay, I'll apply, I'll go through. Eventually, I got the word that I had gotten in. So that was it. I was going to be in the Navy, and I honestly preferred to be in the Navy. Again, you know, the when I look back at my Coast Guard deployments, the one in Asia was much more traditionally of a Navy type of deployment, kind of more traditional military, you know, dealing with, you know, competing nations, things like that. Whereas the more traditional Coast Guard mission was going to South America, chasing down the drug runners, more of like kind of a law enforcement, going after trans-criminal organizations type of thing. I was much more interested in kind of that more military, you know, dealing with, you know, competing powers type of thing. So the Navy was already making more sense. It's a larger branch, so there's more opportunity to advance and get retirement. So that's a plus. And then, you know, when we'd be there's just more training opportunities, especially as reservists. There's more opportunities to take active orders, different training things to do. When we deploy overseas and we'd stop at these bases, I'd see how many resources they had, how big their, you know, exchanges were, how they'd have hotels on base. There was just all this stuff that there was just more opportunities in the Navy. So it just made complete sense. And I commissioned in as an officer in the Navy Reserve.
All right, and then tell me about how that works now that you're in the reserves compared to full-time in the Coast Guard.
So when I first commissioned, it's very interesting the way the Navy does it. You don't even have to fight for your commission. It took a couple months. I swore in. It took a couple months for them to actually get me to start drilling. But I was in graduate school at the University of Miami at the time. So my local Navy Reserve Center, they call it NRCs, was in North Miami. And I just showed up there one day, and then they were like, well, we'll put you at a local unit here. Since I was intelligence, it was the called JIOC South at the U.S. Southern Command there in Miami. So I just started showing up and drilling there. And really the purpose of it was more training at that point in time, because that summer I had to go to what's called Officer Development School. That's the shorter version of Officer Candidate School. Navy Officer Candidate School is like I think 13, about 12 weeks of very intense initial military training. On the reserve side, since there's a lot of career professionals, they don't want to pull people out for 12 weeks, and they don't want to, they want to attract candidates who may not want to go to that 13-week program. Also, a lot of us were prior service, so we had gone through that initial tough training before. So they kind of didn't see a reason to send a lot of us there, even though some people weren't prior service and kind of slid through the cracks, if you will. It just made sense to put us in that program versus the 13-week one. They used to have a 12-week one for reservists, but that was just for the people who weren't prior service, that was just not enough training. So they put us into this 5-week one that also included active duty people that were lawyers, nurses, doctors, kind of these professional careers that the Navy needed more than they needed the Navy. Those individuals needed the Navy. So someone who's a doctor, right, with an MD, they're not necessarily going to want to take kind of a pay cut and go through a very intense boot camp to essentially take a pay cut. So it was the Navy's way of enticing people like that of coming in to give them a much easier one and to be commissioned beforehand. So you come in there with a commission, whereas the active folks were fighting for a commission. By being a reservist, I was lucky to be put into that program, and it definitely had its challenges. But in comparison to that Coast Guard one, it was night and day. Part of it was because I had already been indoctrinated into the military. Part of it was because I had, 3 deployments under my belt at this point in time. I know some of these people who were coming straight out of law school were like, oh, this is pretty intense. But for me, it was a cakewalk. It was designed to be much easier, and it really wasn't that bad.
And what year was this?
This was summer of 2022.
And when did you get to the campus of the University of Miami?
I got there so I technically started with online classes in the summer of 21, but I first stepped on campus in fall, so August of 2021.
All right. And what were you taking while you were there?
So I was getting a master's of international administration. I knew I had wanted to move to Florida, and like this is during COVID times, so it was tough. Everybody wanted to live in Florida unless you had a network there or knew people there. It was a tough thing to kind of just go straight in. Some people had remote jobs and you could move there, but otherwise it was a tough situation. So that's when I kind of had this light bulb. But I was like, I had the GI Bill. I could get another master's. Since I had enjoyed that deployment to Asia so much, I really got interested in international relations. So I figured, hey, I should get some kind of master's in international relations. And it sounds bad, but with the GI Bill and yellow ribbon, you're not paying for the school. So my way of thinking coming to Florida was, I could go to UF or FSU, and both public universities are much cheaper price than the University of Miami, or I could go to the University of Miami, which is much more expensive. Either way, I'm paying $0. So why would I not go to the more expensive university? That was kind of my thought process coming in. And so I chose UM. And I'm very happy I did because I loved living in Miami. I made a lot of friends. I had a great time there, especially meeting other veterans there in the veterans community there. And I love what I studied. I love my professors. It was it ended up being a really, really awesome experience.
And how long were you on campus for?
A year and a half.
All right. And you got your master's in international
administration.
Yep.
So it's sort of like a mix of international relations and public administration, and to kind of combine into one master's.
So you got another master's degree, but this time from the University of Miami.
Yes. The first time it was in liberal studies from the University of Southern California.
Got it. Okay. And when you are in the Navy Reserves, are you doing double duty, so student and reserves, or you finish school first?
I was doing both. So, that summer is when I went to officer development school. And then I would, 1 weekend a month, I was essentially just coming in and doing Navy work.
All right. And what was that experience like, being student, being, naval reserveman?
It was cool. I liked it. I recall being at the camp. It was one of my first drill weekends I had to do, and it was very traditional military, going through training. I had the uniform on. And I remember specifically coming back to my apartment in Miami, taking off the uniform, and I had my military backpack with the little American flag patch, and I put my Navy cover on top of it. Next to it was my student backpack, and I had like a University of Miami hat on top of it, and it just showed the two sides of like student and military, and it was just to compare and contrast, like to come from that like kind of military professional weekend. The weekend after, I went to spring break, which is really interesting as a graduate student at 30. But what had happened was I ended up having such a fun experience at U Miami because I looked pretty young for my age at the time. A lot of my friends that I had made, even though I made quite a few in my cohort, a lot were the other students in the veteran club. And they were all undergrads, but they were, 25, 26. They had never been to college before. So their mindset was like, we want the real college experience. So they were, tailgating before football games, going to spring break. So by walking into the veterans lounge and becoming friends with all of them, I was sort of getting sucked back into being an undergrad myself, which was ironic, even though they were 25, 26 and I was 30 at the time. I looked younger than them for sure. I was clean shaven, no tattoos. As a lot of veterans, a lot of these guys had beards and tattoos. So they looked older than me. I was fitting in as an undergrad more than they were. And it was wild, like, doing tailgating, we went to spring break in Fort Lauderdale and, stayed at a cheap motel on the beach, had a lot of fun. And I remember specifically that week, the weekend before I was on drill, it was like me being this professional naval officer. The next week I was a college kid again. It was a very big contrast.
Yeah. And so tell me about your experience with the Veterans Resource Center and connecting with other veterans on school.
So it was interesting. So when like I said, my big purpose initially coming to University of Miami was as a way to break into move to Florida, break into a network there. I didn't anticipate, I was 29, about to be 30. I did not anticipate going and being a college student again. I just assumed that I'd be somebody going, 2, 3 times a week at night, do class, and then go home and be like a young professional. But I remember that I wanted to get familiarized with campus that first day, and the first day in person, so it was August. And I was just kind of walking around, and I remember being at the student kind of union area. I forget what it was called, but that main kind of student area. I remember walking into the lobby there, and it was like a guide of different places, and one of them was like Veterans Lounge. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Like, I don't know many people in town. Like, I should go check this out. Didn't think much of it. I went up there. I met the two buddies of mine who I'm still in touch with, became very good friends with. And we were just kind of, talking, hanging out, talking about the military. They were, telling me about life at college. There was like, again, these guys are like 24, 25. So and this is the first time in undergrad. So they're still in that very collegey mindset. Again, which at 25 is kind of old, but like these guys did 4 or 5 years in the military before. So they're making up for lots of time. They're getting experience they never had. So this is very much their mindset. So like 2, 3 hours had gone by. I was hanging out, and veterans were coming in and out. I was making all these new friends like that, that shared experience for being in the military. So it was like, wow, this is kind of cool. And I started going and doing homework there, and, they would have events, and I was starting to go on events there. They put me on they had me on as an unofficial role on the board as like the graduate, student representative for the club. And it ended up being awesome. I made a lot of friends through that. And again, it really sucked me back into this college undergraduate mindset. Did you ever see the show called Younger, or read the book called Younger? It's basically about a show about a 40-year-old woman who looked really young for her age. Her husband divorced her daughter went off to college, wanted to go back to work, but no one would hire her because she was 40. So she lied about her age. She said she was 20 or 27, I think it was, and everyone believed her. She moved to the city, and she lived her life as like a 27-year-old, even though she was 40. It was kind of just a fun show. I didn't lie about my age or anything, but I remember watching that show and living this lifestyle in college. Here I was a 30-year-old. I felt like I was a 22-year-old, and I looked very young for my age at the time. Looked younger than all these other veterans did. So I was really getting away with kind of being a college kid. It was really fun to do that experience over again. And I think if it wasn't for the Veterans Club, I wouldn't have had, this last little go around with youth that I was able to have there.
Very nice. It looks like the Veterans Resource Center had a really positive, good impact on your transition to the academic world all over again. Mm-hmm. How about the opposite? How did, if it did, the military help you as a student?
Well, I noticed that, I wasn't about I graduated my bachelor's cum laude. In high school, I wasn't a great student. So, it was a struggle to learn how to be a good student really on my own as an undergrad. And I did pretty well. I finished cum laude. And then with the graduate degree, my first graduate degree, obviously it gets a little more intense, the work. So I think I finished with a 3.2 GPA, which isn't terrible. But at the University of Miami, I ended up finishing with a 3.97 GPA. And I think there's various reasons for that, but I definitely attribute the military, kind of the structure, really being forced to be an adult in that kind of environment, the discipline, to becoming a better student later on.
And given your experience, would you have any advice for veterans who want to pursue a college education after military service?
Yeah, 100%. I would say do it. Some people don't want to do it. Some people think, oh, it's not for me, or I shouldn't do this, or I should, do something else. I would say, do what's best for you. Like, obviously you have to think for yourself, but I highly recommend going to school. A lot of people want to go to college and can't afford it. And, we have this earned benefit that all of us earned that gives you free college that a lot of people don't get. I would also argue go to a more expensive private school if it's under yellow ribbon. If it's not the right program for you or in the area, definitely understand. But I definitely have the philosophy of like getting more bang for your buck. Going to a school that is more expensive. Again, me going to the University of Miami, not a cheap school, much more Florida State or University of Florida. it's free either way for me. It's free for veterans either way with the Yellow Ribbon program. So I highly recommend, trying to get the most bang for your buck, because this is an earned advantage that we have that most people don't.
And what about anything specific to adapting from a military life to being all of a sudden on campus being a college student? Any tips or advice for that transition?
I would definitely say join, a veteran student organization if your university has one, because you have people who have been doing it a year or two already that understand that kind of transition. They can help guide you through it, ease you into it. For me, I had gone to 2 universities. I had 2 degrees beforehand, so it was just really reverting back to what I had been before. I knew the game already. I understand that's not most people who go through the service, especially on the enlisted side. So I would say, use the Veteran Resource Center, join veteran clubs, make friends with other veterans, and then they ease you into it.
So now you are presently in the Navy Reserves. What kind of work are you doing now?
In the Navy Reserve, I am an intelligence officer is my primary duty. So it depends where I'm working. My main operational unit is currently in New Orleans. I'm potentially going to be changing units, but the work that we do there now is focused on European issues, particularly the Russia-Ukraine issue. I also kind of do a lot of collateral work. So like I said, I've been taking as many orders as I can. So I've worked various fleet weeks. I've worked on, the Special Forces week up in Tampa. I've done the International Sea Symposium at the War College, where you work with foreign navies. So I do a lot of collateral work as well. I do funerals sometimes as well, locally here in Palm Beach. There's an elderly population here, so lots of Navy veterans do pass away, unfortunately. But I'm somebody that will go to the funerals, in my dress whites and present them with a flag. So there's various work I do, but the main work is intelligence work, primarily Russia-Ukraine issues. But I've also, helped out working on issues in South America. So my training unit is the U.S. Southern Command. The way the Navy Reserve works out, you have like your main operational unit, and that can be anywhere. Then you have your training unit, which is more local. So for me, it's Southcom in Miami. But when I've done active time with them, I've helped out in various issues related to South America. I think most recently it was about April, May-ish. I was up there kind of assisting and working on projects related to the gang issues going on in Haiti.
Okay. And then which group are you with when you say you're operating out of New Orleans?
I'm with the DIA.
Okay. All right. And what kind of, when you say you're doing like intelligence, like specifically what kind of things are you analyzing or doing?
I probably don't want to go too in depth on that.
All right.
Yeah.
But okay, how about without specifics, but are you analyzing reports? Are you, what kind of things do you do?
You just kind of analyze various things, just to kind of be as vague as possible. Regardless of whatever region you're in, yeah, you look at different new open source side, for example, right? Different news stories that come out, look into it, look over things. Again, I'm trying to be as vague as possible. The nature of the intelligence field is you got to be very vague. So
okay,
yeah,
you're creating reports probably to send up to somebody else to review.
A lot of it's, yeah, you could say that. A lot of it, briefing too. Briefing is a big part of the work you do.
Okay.
It's kind of a well-known thing.
And how does that work? Well, how often do you do that? Is that once a month or?
It just depends when I'm taking orders, what kind of orders I take. A lot of the extracurricular orders that I take are in relation to sea symposiums and fleet weeks and things like that. But sometimes it is more of my actual, job. And so it really just varies. And then usually the once a month, especially the reservists, you're just kind of doing administration type stuff.
Okay. And do you have another job besides your Navy Reserve?
So no, right now I've just been taking as many orders as I can with the Navy Reserve to try to make it like a full-time job. I have to pass through some qualifications, and then I can start taking like 2-3 year orders to make it like a full-time job. I might do that. but I'm also looking at potentially getting a civilian job within the Department of Defense or some kind of related international relations or security-oriented field.
And what was the thought process behind joining the reserves versus going into the Navy full-time?
I was kind of ready to be out of it full-time after my 4 years in the Coast Guard. And as I said before, I initially, saw myself working in public policy. I kind of wanted to still have one foot in the military, one foot out, especially working in public policy, focusing on those issues. I wanted to still have a connection to that world, not just look at what I had done. So that was kind of the big push in staying reserves. And when that didn't play out, I'd still gotten accepted in the Navy Reserve, and I was kind of like, okay, let's do this.
All right. And so far, what has been your most memorable event while in the military? If you had to pick one, will it be the Taiwan Straits or something else?
Yeah, I guess it's hard to make one moment, but I would say that Taiwan Straits was probably arguably that or my first drug chase were probably the most intense moments in a good way.
Okay. And how about your proudest moment so far in the military?
I think coming back from every time we come back from those 3 deployments, you'd have people with flags kind of celebrating you. I think the first one might have been we were actually going through to drop the drugs off in Port Everglades there in Fort Lauderdale. And there were people outside their houses when you enter there with flags and things like that. And that was really cool to see, the American citizens come and really celebrate the hard work that you had just done for the past couple months.
Very nice. Any particular awards that you would like to mention that are part of your military career?
I have a couple. They're kind of all from the Coast Guard. If I had to pick one that was special, I had gotten the exact title was Commandant. It was a Commandant Award for doing that deployment to Asia, which was a harder one to get. Everybody on the boat got it, so it wasn't like it was just a singular thing for me. I think the Good Conduct Award was one I liked as well. A lot of people get in trouble pretty easily in the military, so a Good Conduct Medal in the Coast Guard. It was every 2 or 3 years. I believe it was 3. That with nothing wrong, no write-ups, no negative page 7s, and then you get a ribbon for it, and I had earned that ribbon from being behaved.
Very nice. All
yeah.
Right. Is there anything you would like to add that I did not ask you already?
No, I think you covered quite a bit.
Okay. All right. How about this? Final question. Is there anything you would like to tell future generations or maybe even yourself sometime down the road since you're so young?
Yeah, especially future generations, I think the military is a great career. You get people from all walks of life, from different backgrounds and situations, kind of in one, melting pot of people. It's a great way to kind of become more cultured and meet more people, be exposed to different types of people. But it's just a great way too, I think, to start a career, even if you don't want to have a career in the military. The discipline it gives you, the skill sets it gives you, the worldly experience it gives you, you can't get otherwise, or normally you wouldn't get otherwise. Rather, I think it's a really unique thing, particularly for people who maybe are kind of lost in life or are not in the best financial situation. It is a way to give you a leg up, and is a way to give you structure. I think there's so much good that comes from it. So anybody with any kind of interest or anybody who feels kind of lost, I think it's a really good thing for people to do. And by serving myself and coming across all sorts of people, I've seen how it's worked for people who have otherwise wouldn't have been in a great situation or otherwise would not have gotten the leg up that they have gotten.
Excellent. Well, Jordan, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today and sharing your story. And I want to thank you for everything that you've done so far for our country. And go Canes.
Go Canes. Thank you. Appreciate it.
The honor of being a veteran is not just in the recognition by others, but in the deep personal pride of having fulfilled a sacred duty. In celebrating veterans, we acknowledge the strength, resilience, and integrity that they represent. Through dedicated research, heartfelt storytelling, and community engagement, it ensures that the legacy of service endures and that future generations never forget the courage and dedication that have shaped our world. The Making History Project is dedicated to honoring and preserving the voices of our veterans. Thank you for your support.